Good evening, everyone. I'm Noah Levine. I'm with Jewish Community Legacy Project. We're a nonprofit that works exclusively with small congregations all over the country. We help congregations, individual congregations, with their planning, whether it's current issues or long-term issues. And we work with over 200 congregations around the country. We don't charge for our services. We don't represent any organization, but we're heavily involved in partnerships, just as we're involved with the Federation here in Western PA. In addition to working with individual congregations, we recognize that there are congregations in a region that don't necessarily have the resources to do programming. So what we've done is we brought congregations together into regional cohorts, as we call them. Central PA, the Carolinas, Ohio, Greater Mississippi, Upper Midwest, Texas, and Western PA. We've been involved now with we've been involved with West congregations in Western PA, over 20 of them since 2010 or 11. But it's been the last 4 years that we've had the regional cohorts with a whole variety of programming. And I'm going to, that's right, I'm going to mute everybody. Hold on. And we've a variety of programs for the last 4 years. And our committee, which consists of representatives of each of these small congregations of 13, 14 congregations, have developed this year's program. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly show you what we have in mind. Then what I'll do is say a couple of things about some other programs, and then we'll introduce our guest speaker. So Rabbi Schiff is going to be speaking in a moment. I'll introduce him. But the other programs, in December, Sean Brokaus, who is the Director of Community Security at the Federation, is going to be giving a how-to presentation for synagogues and members of synagogues. Backed by popular demand, just like with Rabbi Schiff, is Eric Lidgy, who's the Executive Director of the Rao Jewish Archives, who is going to be speaking this year on super small Jewish communities. And then final program, Joan Forscher, who will be sharing with her history in Haggadot, which he collects, and tying in diaspora food with that. So we have a real eclectic program for the year. In addition to which, we are going to be offering an online Florence Melton learning education program. And if you haven't heard about the Florence Melton, it's one of the preeminent adult learning projects in the country, in the world. And they have many different types of models, but the committee decided that they wanted to focus for this first year on an online program. It's only open to 20 people. We'll be sending information shortly. There'll be 6 sessions probably in January, and Rabbi Schiff will be our teacher. In addition to which, each of your congregations, if you have programs that you would like to publicize to all the other congregations, all you need to do is just send it to me, and then I will send it to the Western PA Small Congregations Committee, and they'll distribute it to their membership. Because in addition to providing the programs that we're doing, the JCLP and the Western Regional Cohort, each of your congregations do some phenomenal programming as well. So there's a lot of really, really good stuff going on in this region. And talking about good stuff, it's my pleasure once again for the 3rd year in a row to introduce Rabbi Dr. Danny Schiff, who is the Gefsky Community Scholar at the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh. He's a noted teacher and researcher in Jewish ethics. He has previously served as the community scholar for the Agency for Jewish Learning in Pittsburgh, as well as rabbi of B'nai Israel in White Oak, and as rabbi at Temple Beth Israel in Melbourne, Australia. He is the author of Abortion in Judaism, published by Cambridge University Press, and a forthcoming book on the future of non-Orthodox Judaism. He is a former board member of the City of Pittsburgh Ethics Board and the Society of Jewish Ethics. 2 years ago, Rabbi Schiff spoke about the A to Z's of anti-Israel anti-Semitism. Last year, he spoke about the horrific actions that took place on October 7th. This year, he will be speaking about the aftermath and what we have to look forward. There's just one other note in his biography, which I know all of us can agree, is that Rabbi Schiff truly is a blessing to the community. Rabbi Schiff?
No, that's an exceptionally generous introduction, for which I am very grateful indeed. And I'm really pleased to be together again with this large group of people from all sorts of congregations across our region, across Western Pennsylvania. And I know the dedication and the commitment of the people in this virtual room. I especially want to recognize the people from Temple B'nai Israel in White Oak who are here with us. I see quite a number. I give them a shout out because, of course, I served as the rabbi, was honored and privileged to serve as the rabbi of B'nai Israel in White Oak for a 16-year period, and my affections for that congregation, as well as for the other congregations now in our region, are very strong. We meet tonight just a few days before Rosh Hashanah, at the conclusion of a Jewish year like no other in our lifetimes. A year ago, as Noah said, I had the opportunity to speak about October the 7th, when the memories were extraordinarily fresh, when we were just really coming to terms with what had happened. And now, a year later, who could have imagined that we would be coming together this evening, still at war, in what has now become Israel's longest war in its history, and a war that isn't just being fought by the Israel Defense Forces, but is being fought around the world. Because in many ways, my talk this year is a combination and an expansion of the observations I made about anti-Semitism 2 years ago, combined with the October the 7th events last year, and what that has now produced. We are fighting a war in Israel on multiple fronts, and that war, as you know, has become much more intense in just the last few hours because of the extraordinary way in which the IDF has now decided that it must tackle the great threat of Hezbollah. And as well as that, we are fighting a war around the Jewish world, a war on the highest levels of anti-Semitism that we have seen in our lifetimes. And all of that makes this an unprecedented year, in our experience at least, and an unprecedented holiday season upon which we are about to embark. So let me begin with these familiar words. On Rosh Hashanah, it is written. On Yom Kippur, it is sealed. How many shall pass away and how many shall be born? Who shall live and who shall die? Who shall reach the end of his days and who shall not? Who shall perish by fire and who by water? Who by sword? and who by wild beast, who by famine and who by thirst, who by earthquake and who by plague, who by strangling and who by stoning, who shall have rest and who shall wander, who shall be at peace and who shall be pursued, who shall be at rest and who shall be tormented, who shall be exalted and who shall be brought low, who shall become rich and who shall be impoverished. But repentance, prayer, and charity avert the severe decree. We are at that time of the Jewish year when we focus upon the ultimate meaning of life itself. This is not a time when we are concerned simply with holiday meals and break the fast opportunities. This is a time when we think deeply about life and death and the seriousness of the situation in which we find ourselves and the opportunity that this time of the year affords to remake our own individual responses to the moment in which we are now located. When we read Unetane Tokef, those chilling words about who shall live and who shall die and in what manner, we are reminded personally and viscerally that terrible death happens so easily. And as we approach the first anniversary of October the 7th, we recall to mind those 1,200 and more members of our people, beloved Jews, young and old, who were slaughtered simply because they are Jewish, they were Jewish. We remember that terrible death happens so easily. And unlike other peoples, we conclude as a consequence that how we live our lives every single day therefore matters. If we live in the shadow of death, we don't look to some opportunity for making it all better in some afterlife to come, though that certainly might be a possibility. What we focus upon as a people is how we live our lives each and every day in the shadow of the reality of so much that we cannot control. What we do, the steps we take, the responses we give to the circumstances around about us matter individually and collectively. We head into these high holidays different from any time in the past. And tonight, what I want to do is I want to reflect on the last 12 months that have shaken the Jewish world in the light of the themes of the great days that are ahead of us. Because let us say the following: Jewish history has returned this year with a vengeance in a way that we have not experienced previously. For so many of the last decades, since the Holocaust, we got used to a different type of reality, a reality where, to be sure, anti-Semitic evil would rear its head from time to time. God knows that we in the greater Pittsburgh area know full well that particular truth. But we had not been subject to the nature of how so much of Jewish history has been lived throughout the ages. At its core, let us remember, the Jewish saga is actually a struggle to respond with as much virtue as we can possibly muster when confronted with unrelenting evil. Not episodic evil, as occurred on October the 27th, 2018, but unrelenting evil. That form of evil that will not cease until it can achieve its goal, its vision of a world transformed in its own image. That form of evil, which comes from a regime, a power that dreams of a world without Jews. Jewish history has returned with a vengeance. On Yom Kippur afternoon, we will recite the martyrology, that list of 10 rabbis who were slaughtered, put to death, because they stood for something definitive, because they represented a tradition that dared to call for what Jonathan Sachs alerts us to being the dignity of difference. A tradition that stakes its claim to seeking the notion that we will not all ultimately become the same. The totalitarian regimes will be swept away, and that in the end of days, the vision of the prophet Isaiah will prevail, that nations in their plurality, in their great difference and divergence, will one day live together in peace. It was that daring vision that those 10 rabbis, during the time of the Mishnah, when the Romans were so cruel, that was the vision that they expressed. And for that vision, they were martyred. They were made into what our tradition calls kiddushim, individuals who lost their lives, individuals who died simply because they were Jews. To the list of kiddushim, we have added many, many hundreds this year. When we read that martyrology on Yom Kippur afternoon, when we go through the words of Unatane Tokef, as we will several times in the days ahead, we will all shudder, reminded that none of this is from the distant unknown past. It now lives again as a reality in our own time. And that's why these months have so shaken the Jewish world. At a time when we imagine that after the Shoah, we would never again go back to a time when the Jewish people would ask itself the question, where exactly can we go truly to be safe? We have gone back to asking that question again. On Rosh Hashanah, in the Reform movement, they will read the account of Abraham and Isaac, the Akedah, on the first day. In the rest of the Jewish world, they'll read the same text on the second day. Abraham is told by God, take your son, the son that you love, Isaac, take him up onto the mountain and offer him there as a burnt offering. And we shudder. How can this be? How could God ask Abraham to do such a thing? What is the nature of this test? This most strenuous, most arduous test of a parent imaginable. And perhaps even more importantly, did Abraham pass the test? What was he being asked to show? This was a test of his belief, his loyalty, his devotion to God. And he was supposed to pass the test by demonstrating that he'd be prepared to sacrifice Isaac in order to show that he was loyal to God. Did he pass the test or did he fail the test? The commentators of Jewish history go both ways. There are some who say he passed the test because ultimately he followed what God asked him to do, and it turned out all right in the end. And there are those who say he failed. He should have done what he did at Sodom and Gomorrah, spoken up, refused, stepped away from an instruction that was altogether too awful to contemplate. We are the people that is tested, that time and time again is confronted with ethical dilemmas that are nigh impossible, and wherein we are asked to try to pass the test, just as Abraham was tested on Mount Moriah, just as the tradition asked him to wrestle with one of the most impossible conundrums, to demonstrate his loyalty to God or to show his devotion to his child. We too are tested in ways that few people ever can imagine. Think about just this last year, the ways in which the Jewish people has been tested by impossibly difficult questions, dilemmas that are ultimately so painful and so problematic. Let me give you a few examples. Should we fight Hamas with all that we have in order to stamp out the evil that Hamas represents? Or should we pause the battle in order to rescue the hostages taken from their families and from their nation so cruelly? When it comes to the hostages, if the deal ultimately means that returning the hostages, however many remain alive, back to their homes, dictates that we must release from Israeli jails heinous murderers who have sworn that they will go back to their terrorist ways and murder other Jews if released. Is that a deal that we can contemplate? To return hostages, pidyon shivuyim, one of the highest values of Jewish tradition, pitted against the reality that if we do that, the price that must be paid is to put others, potentially many others, at great risk of savage death in the future? How should one respond to that question? Should we feed and nourish the enemy? Provide them with food and medical care, knowing full well that it will strengthen them for subsequent rounds of attacks against us? How do we defend ourselves against charges of genocide in what is so patently a war of self-defense, but what has been characterized in the most bizarre transformation as a war of genocide against the Palestinians? How defend against such a charge? How far should we go to protect civilians on the other side, if doing so allows enemy fighters to slip away and expands the danger to our own troops? How does a culture of life that does everything possible to protect life and defend life stand up against and confront a culture of death for whom its own population is ultimately expendable? 7 or 8 tests, diabolically difficult tests from a list that could be expanded greatly. And we have to ask ourselves, are we passing the test? Are we failing? This is the time of the year. Now is the moment for cheshbon hanefesh, for exploring, doing the calculation of how we are responding to these enormous challenges. Let's state the obvious. There is no other people on the face of the planet being tested with even a few of these all too difficult problems, let alone the combination that we have in front of us. Professor Asa Kasher, a professor of legal ethics in Israel, who is one of the authors of the IDF Code, the Israel Defense Forces Code of Conduct that governs and shapes the way in which Israeli soldiers and the IDF in general responds to these impossible dilemmas, wrote an article in Haaretz, the Israeli daily newspaper, one of the Israeli daily newspapers, just a week ago, evaluating how well we are doing on some of these most difficult questions. And I want to share just a few paragraphs of what Asa Kasher wrote in his article with you in order to just demonstrate how difficult the problems are and how Kasher evaluates the way in which we have been ultimately responding in these circumstances. Here's Kasher. So in the highlighted paragraph, the top of the page, Kasher writes the following about the IDF and how it functions. The IDF has a distinct ethical identity that should guide the conduct of every commander and every soldier in every military situation. These include the same principles that guide every military organization: adherence to mission, professionalism, discipline, and comradeship, but also a number of unique ethical principles meant to defend human dignity, namely preserving life and maintaining purity of arms, taharat haneshek, the concept that comes from within our tradition. The IDF's principles should be expressed both by the organization, which is the state's military arm, and by each individual soldier and commander when acting as the IDF's representatives. Jump down to the next highlighted paragraph. Israel, writes Kasher, highlighting the extraordinary difficulty. Israel is currently fighting an enemy that disregards all moral principles, whether of democracy, restraint, just war theory, or accepted norms of compassion and human dignity. The circumstances of the confrontation entail a danger that we might exempt ourselves from following our own principles, right? The circumstances are so tough that some people would say, we're exempt. If they're going to behave awfully, we can behave awfully as well. To which Kasher says, and our desire for revenge might be influenced by the enemy's behavior. Only a clear construct and successful implementation of the values and principles that guide the actions of those who wear the IDF uniform can protect our identity from the enemy's influence. Translation: we are a people rooted in morality, for whom the way in which we fight is highly consequential and informs, ultimately is rooted in the notions of the value of life to which we are devoted. And we might ask the question, as Kasher does, so how exactly are we doing if that's the scale that we're supposed to live up to? And here Kasher actually answers the question towards the end of his article. Kasher says the following: the principles of morality and the theory of just war require avoiding, insofar as is possible, harming people living in the enemy country if they are not participants in the hostilities. Every aspect of intentional harm to non-combatants is wrong. It violates the duty to preserve human dignity. It violates the principle of distinguishing between hostile forces and non-combatants, according to the just war theory, and it violates the IDF value of purity of arms. I am unaware, critical sentence, I am unaware of such violations having been committed during the current Gaza war. In other words, Kasher, who has been interviewed time and time again by international media, and who has watched the conduct of the IDF through more than 11 months of battle, has now written in this particular piece that when it comes to treating non-combatants, one of the great tests of will we live up to our own ethical standards, I am unaware of violations to the IDF code having been committed during the current Gaza war. Now, before you say to yourself, wow, that seems to be a rather broad statement, know that Kasher qualifies it in this last paragraph. The Israeli Air Force and other IDF branches operate according to the principle of proportionality. We cannot know which equations allow non-combatants to be harmed in situations where significant military benefit can be expected. In a targeted killing familiar outside the context of war, considerations of proportionality seem reasonable. It is possible, important sentence, it is possible that during air and ground activity in the Swords of Iron campaign, our current campaign in Gaza, restraint may at times have been insufficient to pass the proportionality test. Are we passing the test or failing the test? Like Abraham on Mount Moriah, we are being tested with some of the most difficult, most problematic, most challenging ethical conundrums that any people has had to face. And Kasher ultimately comes to the conclusion in his piece that while we are doing exceptionally well for the most part, in the context of the reality of war, at living up to our own standards for trying to protect innocent life, even when it's the innocent life of the enemy, we could be doing better. That there are instances where proportionality, the desire to ensure that we don't overstep what is reasonable in terms of targeting combatants where non-combatants might be killed in excessive numbers. Kasher says there are times when we could do better. Cheshbon hanefesh. As a people, we ask ourselves at this time of the year, when confronted with the ultimate tests, when put on the spot as the people that is supposed to exemplify the finest morality, even in the most impossible circumstances. Are we doing good enough? Are we doing well enough? This afternoon, it was announced that anti-Semitism around the world has surged to new heights in 2023, last year. That's no great surprise. It's not a breaking piece of news, but the numbers are. Anti-Semitic hate crimes surged 63% in 2023 to an all-time high, the FBI reports in the United States, of 1,832 reported hate crimes. The spirit of this season is not just about confronting the most difficult tests imaginable. It's also about doing teshuvah. And when we use the word teshuvah, teshuvah means something a great deal more than apologizing for our misdeeds. It actually means returning. That's the essential definition of teshuvah, returning to being the type of person that we really aspire to be. So when we think about those anti-Semitism numbers, and when we ask ourselves the question, as we all ought to do this particular season, what is my responsibility as somebody who lives in America to respond to this particular moment? let the answer to that question not be the one that has become altogether too common. The answer to the question that has become altogether too common is, I should fight anti-Semitism. I should do everything in my power to go out and confront the anti-Semitism in my midst, to call upon elected officials to do more to stand against anti-Semitism, and to demand an environment in which anti-Semitism is tackled on every level. Please don't misunderstand. I'm not against those things. They're all important. There is a cadre of people, professionals, who are devoted to doing that very important work. But ultimately, let me say the following in the spirit of this season. Jews can't do a great deal to fight and defeat anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not something that Jews can defeat. It's a non-Jewish problem that has to be addressed by non-Jews. It is ultimately a conspiracy theory of extraordinary flexibility that can be adapted and purposed and repurposed to new circumstances, as it is constantly, and therefore not really susceptible to you and me addressing it in some serious way on a personal level. What therefore should we do? Teshuvah. Return to being the type of person that will ultimately defeat anti-Semitism in the best way possible. And what is that type of person? Being the most committed, articulate Jew that we can possibly be. After all, what is the best response to the anti-Semite? The anti-Semite who wants to wipe us away or to destroy Jewish influence in the world. It's to stand up and be a better Jew, more committed, more devoted, more demonstrative about the way in which our tradition ultimately makes extraordinary contributions to the advancement of human civilization, and therefore to redouble our engagement with our Jewishness going forward. The best response to anti-Semitism, the most articulate answer we can give to the anti-Semite is, in times of rising anti-Semitism, I devote myself to living as a Jew all the more fully, to returning to the Jewishness that nourishes us and inspires us, and activating it all the more powerfully by returning to that model once again. Last thing I want to say. We are concluding a year in which Israel has fought the longest war. Israel continues at this hour to fight on multiple fronts in a dangerous war that is escalating against Hezbollah, where the West Bank could certainly explode even more than it has already done, where the Iranian front looms, and where Hamas has not been vanquished. At the same time, Israelis suffer deeply from PTSD, from post-traumatic or current traumatic stress that hasn't been alleviated in the course of a year and cannot be properly addressed until the war comes to a conclusion. The country is exhausted and traumatized. The economy is suffering, and this will not be over soon. For those who hoped that the message would be, all will be well in short order, there is, I'm afraid, no way to sugarcoat the current reality. And the current reality is that this war will go on for numerous months to come, until such time as the threat that is posed from multiple different actors can be dealt with, and it will be dealt with, but it will be a difficult and lengthy process. October the 7th, as you know, was Simchat Torah. And it's telling that on Simchat Torah, we read not just the end of the book of Deuteronomy and the beginning of Genesis, but had they been able in those communities in the south of Israel that were so mercilessly and brutally and savagely attacked on October the 7th, had they been able to go to synagogue that morning, they would have also heard the Haftarah that is read on Simchat Torah. And what is the Haftarah that is read on Simchat Torah? The Haftarah is actually the continuation of what happens after the Torah comes to an end. It's the first chapter of the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua, where the Jewish people enter the land, conquer the land. And 3 times in that chapter, God says to Joshua those famous words that were so necessary then and remain so necessary today. Chazak be'ematz, be strong and of good courage. Because ultimately we know full well that we are a millennial people, a people of destiny that has been through times of extended, protracted challenge, difficulty, war before, and has come out on the other side. Not only have we come out on the other side, but the lesson of Jewish history is that when we go through our darkest night, when the valley of the shadow of death is deepest and most painful, that what happens in the aftermath is usually a Jewish renaissance of profound dimensions. Think about it. After the destruction of the temple, we didn't go away. We rose up and created the Talmud and Rabbinic Judaism. After the Crusades, we put together a flourishing of Jewish life in Europe. And 1945 was followed by 1948. There is a lesson in Jewish history. It's the message of Simchat Torah. The Torah is eternal, and there will yet be a new beginning to turn to, even after this. Thank you very much.
Rabbi, that was beautiful, beautifully stated, powerful, inspirational. It's a message for us in this high holy day season, but also an eternal message for our people.
Yeah.
what I would like to do is, if it's okay with you, is to invite the group to ask questions. Would that be all right?
Absolutely.
I would like to start off, and then what I'd like to ask you to do, if you have a question, unmute yourself. Don't unmute yourself unless you have a question. If you have a question, unmute yourself, state your name and your community, and then ask the rabbi. What I would like to ask you is, what breaks the will of a people? How does a people withstand so much that comes not just from enemies, but from a world that is satisfied to seeing this pressure on Israel and not willing to do what is necessary? Now, of course, there are some that are helping, but so much is not. And I'm just curious, how long can a people withstand year after year of that kind of pressure?
A very long time. A people that knows its history, and a people that understands its destiny, and a people that is aware that we do not dwell alone, but that we have allies and supporters who walk this road with us, because we've already transformed history to a certain extent, by far not enough yet, but to a certain extent, that has brought allies to our side. That people can do extraordinary things. And one of the features of our current circumstances that gives me enormous hope is looking at the younger generation in Israel and in the United States, and seeing how they are responding, not all, but in great numbers, to this moment by rallying to their identity, rallying to fight the fight that needs to be engaged, and determined that they will strengthen their connections to their people and not walk away. I think there is a great reason to have hope because of that, and a people that can count on knowing and understanding its history and its destiny and the power of its future won't give up.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you a question. This is Mike Rotman from the Young People's Synagogue. You talked at times about individual Jewish people, and I sent you this in a chat question, and how we all respond and whether we pass the test. But how does a single Jewish person pass the test of this war and this just war when not the individual Jew, but the Prime Minister of Israel is making the decisions on how to fight the war, whether justly, not justly, many different opinions, sometimes with vast opposition from the people of his own country, including the hostage families. What do I do to make sure that the war is just and that we win when I don't control the army, I don't control the decision making? The war cabinet, and not just the war cabinet, the prime minister does.
Mike, thanks for being here, and it's a very important question. My response to you is the following: I have said in other places, and I'll repeat it here tonight, that I think that we have the most problematic government in Israel's history leading the country at this particular juncture. And I say problematic precisely because I think some of the elements in the government are leading the country in ways that are highly problematic when it comes to the hostages and to other values that are at their core Jewish, that I think that they are looking past. That having been said, this is not the first juncture, as you well know, in Jewish history when we have had unfortunate Jewish leaders. The Jewish people has survived far worse Jewish leaders. Refer you to the time of the Hasmonean dynasty and other periods in Jewish history. And our job as Jews, who are not necessarily the decision makers at a particular time is to ensure that the way in which the Jewish people understands the correct responses and the way in which the conversation ultimately develops and what we teach our children about these moments, how to pass the test correctly, even if our leaders are perhaps not passing it correctly at times, that is highly consequential for the nature of how we move forward at this particular juncture. You're right, of course, that those of us who don't sit around cabinet tables or army decision-making conversations are not the ones who ultimately will get to make the decisions, but we are part and parcel of these critical conversations that will shape the Jewish future. And here in America, how we express ourselves on these matters is very consequential, and therefore we should engage in these conversations robustly in order to ensure that the Jewish response to this is the appropriate one.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you. Anyone else? Just unmute yourself. And anybody want to share? Question, comment? You answered everybody's hidden thoughts, Rabbi. If anybody has, after this program, something that they thought of and would like the rabbi to respond to, you can email me. When I send out the recording, I'll put the rabbi's email address if you want to ask him directly. The rabbi mentioned conversations. This is a great opportunity within each of your own synagogues during Oneg or whenever to come together and continue the discussion that Rabbi Schiff has started today, as well as around all of our families' Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur tables. So Rabbi Danny Schiff, thank you so much. This time next year, and hopefully your message is going to be a lot brighter.
Let's hope.
I can promise you, you'll receive an invitation. So
thank you.
So thank you. Wish everyone a happy and a healthy and a peaceful and a sweet new year. And we look forward to seeing you in December, in January, and in April for the other programs. Shana Tova, everyone.
Shana Tova.
I know.